The morning fog wrapped the streets of San Francisco in a damp hush as Julia Hayes walked briskly toward the imposing structure of Westwood Music Academy. Her gray cardigan, paired with a modest navy dress, made her look more like a librarian than someone attending an elite musical event. Around her, students bustled with excitement, their instrument cases stamped with logos from Juilliard, Curtis, and other renowned conservatories. They laughed and chatted about scales, scores, and speculations surrounding the day's guest, the legendary and feared Constance Wellington. Julia kept her eyes down and held her worn leather notebook close. Inside were years of compositions, her lifeblood. At 33, Julia had carved a quiet life in music, arranging for small orchestras and composing scores for modest productions. Her work was played often, but her name never appeared in lights. That anonymity suited her fine. She had long since stepped out of the spotlight. "Excuse me," she murmured as she passed a huddle of violinists whispering about Constance. "Did you hear?" she said. "Taylor Fischer's Carnegie Hall debut was technically perfect but soulless. That's all it took." His career tanked overnight. Julia winced. She remembered that review. It had made headlines for its cruelty. Constance Wellington didn't critique performances. She dismantled them. Inside the Academy's front doors, Julia approached the reception desk. "I'm here for the Composition and Performance Connection seminar." The receptionist didn't look up. "Room 342, sign in." As Julia scribbled her name, the woman finally glanced at her. "Student or faculty?" "Neither," Julia said. "I'm a composer. My publisher arranged for me to observe." The receptionist arched an eyebrow, handing her a visitor badge with a flat expression that bordered on disapproval. As she rode the elevator up, Julia replayed her publisher's recent words. "Your work is brilliant, Julia, but it lacks heart. You write like someone who's never held an instrument." That wasn't true. For 15 years, Julia had lived and breathed the violin. Her fingers had known calluses, her back the ache of long hours in practice. People once called her gifted, but when it came to performing publicly, her nerves betrayed her. One catastrophic audition at Juilliard had destroyed her confidence. Since then, she'd only composed, never played. Never again. Until today. The elevator dinged. A wave of music drifted down the hallway, a student tuning to a perfect D. Julia's fingers twitched at the sound, instinctive and longing. She shook it off. "Just observe," she reminded herself. "Take notes. Stay invisible." But fate had different plans. Room 342 wasn't an ordinary classroom. It was Westwood's gem, a miniature concert hall with tiered seating and a grand acoustic design. Julia entered through the back, finding a corner seat near the last row. Most of the audience, nearly 60 students, filled the front rows with gleaming violins in their laps. Well-known faces in the middle rows, faculty, professional musicians, sat in quiet anticipation. Exactly at 10 a.m., the air shifted. Constance Wellington entered the room. She was everything her reputation promised. Impeccably dressed in a designer plaid blazer and tailored slacks, her silver hair cut into a sharp bob. At 72, she had the posture and presence of a queen, her gold-rimmed spectacles adding to her severity. Her glance swept the room like a surgeon inspecting a patient before a difficult procedure. "Good morning," she said, her voice cool and exact. "I trust you've all prepared something worthy of my time." Chairs shifted. Breaths were held. "I do not believe in coddling talent," she continued. "The music world is not kind, and neither am I today. I'll select several of you to perform. I will critique you truthfully. If you can't take that, the door's right there." No one moved. Julia stayed very still, her notebook open but her attention riveted. Constance called forward the first student, Alexis Chen, who performed with flawless precision. When the applause came, Constance merely said, "Clean, precise, Utterly forgettable. You play like you're afraid of the music. The girl's face crumpled slightly as she returned to her seat. Two more students followed. Both received equally bruising feedback. Julia scribbled notes, unable to look away. There was something brutally honest about Constance's critiques, as sharp as they were. This wasn't about ego. This was about truth. Then came the moment Julia had dreaded. Constance scanned the room again, eyes falling on the back rows. "You there," she said, pointing directly at Julia, "in the gray cardigan." "I don't recognize you." Julia's throat dried. "I'm just observing," she managed. Constance raised an eyebrow. "Everyone participates in my masterclass." "Come down here." All eyes turned. Julia froze. "I really am just here to observe," she said more firmly. A murmur went through the audience. A student had just dared to challenge Constance Wellington. Constance's lips curled. "Young lady, I've taught for decades. There are no passive observers. Unless," she paused, eyes narrowing, "you have nothing to contribute." That did it. The subtle insinuation burned worse than any insult. Julia stood slowly, walking to the front, notebook in hand like a shield. "What's your name?" Constance asked. "Julia Hayes." "And what do you do, Miss Hayes?" "I'm a composer." "How interesting. Do you play any instruments?" "I don't perform anymore," Julia said quietly. "Of course not," Constance said with false sweetness. "Yet you write music for others to perform." She opened the case, revealing a fine violin. "Play something, anything. Enlighten us." Julia stared at the instrument. 8 years since she'd last held one. 8 years avoiding the spotlight. A tall student near the front whispered to his neighbor, loud enough for Julia to hear, "Maybe she can manage Twinkle Twinkle." More laughter. Constance offered the violin, her eyes daring her. "Consider it a learning opportunity. Even my beginners can manage a scale." Julia's hands trembled as she took the instrument. The weight was familiar, heavy with memories. She could run, refuse, and the moment, or she could play. The room waited. She raised the violin and closed her eyes. The room was still. Julia stood on the small stage, the violin cradled under her chin, its weight as familiar as breath and yet as foreign as a long-lost dream. Her right hand hovered above the strings, well-poised but unmoving. For a moment, everything blurred. Constance's sharp expression, the sea of curious eyes, the echoes of her own fear. "Why did I come here?" she asked herself, panic creeping into her lungs. In the darkness behind her eyelids, an old memory stirred. Her final audition at Juilliard. She had stepped onto the grand stage with a confident smile and a carefully prepared piece. And then, nothing. Her fingers froze, her brain blanked, and the auditorium that once promised opportunity had swallowed her whole in a silence that still haunted her. That failure had driven her away from performance, away from the violin, and into the safety of composition, a quiet life behind the scenes. But standing here now, with 60 expectant strangers and one ruthless critic watching, Julia knew she had a choice. She could play a simple scale, satisfy the mockery, and return to her seat in shame. Or she could reach for something deeper, something that even Constance Wellington couldn't mock. She took a deep breath. "Play your truth," her teacher had once said. "It's not about perfection, it's about honesty." Julia opened her eyes, gazed steady, and drew her bow across the strings. A single G note rang out clear, strong, defiant. The snickers stopped instantly. Then came another note, and another. Not the scale Constance had sarcastically suggested. Not Twinkle, Twinkle, as the student had mocked. It was Bach, the Chaconne from Partie to No. to one of the most emotionally profound and technically demanding works ever written for solo violin. Gasps rippled through the room. Julia's hands, though unused for years, found their rhythm as though no time had passed. Her fingers danced across the strings with control and precision. The room, which moments ago had pulsed with doubt, fell utterly silent. No one expected this, especially not Constance. The critic's pen lowered slowly to her lap. Her brow furrowed not in disapproval, but in surprise. Julia's focus narrowed until nothing existed but the music. The bow in her hand, the strings beneath her fingers, and the truth she had buried inside herself for 8 long years. With every phrase, she poured her emotion into the notes, her fear, her shame, her longing, and her strength. This wasn't just a performance, it was a confession, a reclamation. In the 4th row, the concertmaster of the San Francisco Symphony leaned forward, eyes wide. He recognized the piece and the difficulty it posed. He had played it himself, once, but never like this. Never with this kind of unfiltered vulnerability. Julia's technique was flawless, but more than that, it was honest. Her dynamics flowed like a tide, rising and falling, trembling and surging. Each note felt alive, not simply played but lived. Double stops to notes played at once rang out with startling clarity. Her left hand shifted fluidly across the fingerboard while her right bowed with a grace that commanded the air itself. She wasn't merely revisiting a piece of music, she was revisiting herself. Years of hiding, of telling herself she wasn't enough, began to melt away under the warmth of her own sound. A quiet sniffle from the back row broke the silence as a young woman wiped away tears. Next to her, a faculty member stared in disbelief, shaking his head slowly. It was like watching someone walk on water. In the front row, the smirking student from earlier sat frozen, mouth slightly open. The music shifted from its somber minor key into a moment of lightness. Bach's signature moved from grief to hope. Julia followed, her playing lifting the room with it. The major key glowed like sunlight pushing through heavy clouds. For just a moment, the entire hall was weightless. Then, slowly, the piece began its descent again, returning to its darker roots but now transformed by everything that had come before. Julia's tone deepened, her bow strokes becoming heavier, filled with centuries of sorrow and longing. Every breath in the room seemed to hold. She approached the final bars. Julia opened her eyes. Gone was the nervous woman who had trembled at the reception desk. In her place stood someone who had remembered who she truly was. An artist, a performer, a woman who had something to say and the courage to say it. The final chord rang out, vibrating in the perfect acoustics of the hall like the echo of a soul returned. Silence followed, a silence thicker and heavier than anything before. It stretched, unwilling to break. Then a single person rose to their feet, the concertmaster, and began to clap. Not politely, not out of obligation, with reverence. Others joined, students, faculty, professionals. One by one, they stood, the applause building into a wave that filled the hall. It wasn't just a standing ovation, it was an awakening. Julia lowered the violin slowly, her chest rising and falling with adrenaline. For a moment, she waited for the old fear to return, for her hands to shake, for her breath to falter. But it didn't come. Instead, there was calm. Not the numbness of withdrawal, but the calm that follows a storm that didn't break you. She looked across the room and saw that Constance Wellington had not moved. The woman still sat, her hands resting on her notepad, her eyes unreadable. The ovation continued. Julia turned to face the crowd, offering a faint, sincere smile. Not triumphant, not smug, but grateful, for the chance, for the push, for the reminder that her talent wasn't lost, it had only been waiting. In a single performance, she had changed the room, and in doing so, changed herself. The thunder of applause was still ringing in Julia's ears as it gradually began to fade. What had started as a moment of humiliation had transformed into one of undeniable triumph. People who had ignored her when she slipped into the back of the room now stared at her like she was someone else entirely, someone important, someone powerful. But the one face Julia sought remained still. Constance Wellington had not joined the ovation. She sat with her hands folded over her notepad, her lips pressed into a firm line, and her gaze fixed on Julia like she was trying to solve a puzzle that refused to make sense. As the last claps died down, an expectant hush fell over the room. The students looked back and forth between Julia and Constance, as though waiting for the next move in a tense symphony. And then, Constance stood. Slowly, deliberately, Julia braced herself. The critic walked toward the stage with measured steps, heels clicking softly against the polished wood. When she reached Julia, she stopped, folded her hands behind her back, and looked up. "That," she said, her voice slicing clean through the silence, "was a revelation." A collective breath was released in the room. Some students gasped. Others exchanged stunned glances. Constance Wellington, the woman known for demolishing even the finest performers with a single sentence, had just called Julia's performance a revelation. She turned slightly, addressing the students now. "That, ladies and gentlemen, is what I have been trying to explain to you since this morning. Technique is only the beginning. What Miss Hayes demonstrated transcends precision. What you heard was artistry, truth channeled through an instrument. That is what makes a performance unforgettable." The students sat in stunned silence. Even the most skeptical among them had no argument. She turned back to Julia. "Where did you study?" Julia's voice came out soft. "The Curtis Institute." For a while, Constance nodded. "And why, may I ask, did you stop?" The question lingered in the air, gentle yet piercing. Julia hesitated. Then, for the first time, she spoke the truth aloud. "Performance anxiety. During my Juilliard audition, I froze. Completely. I couldn't even finish. After that, I couldn't do it anymore." Constance's posture shifted, slightly, almost imperceptibly. Her shoulders lowered a fraction. Her expression, usually steel, softened not with pity, but with understanding. "And so," she said quietly, "you turned to composition." Julia nodded. "I never stopped loving music. I just found another way to live in it." Constance studied her for a long moment. Then she gave a small, barely noticeable nod. "Martin Wallace sent you here, didn't he?" she asked. Julia blinked. "Yes. How did you know?" A faint smile played at the corner of Constance's lips. "San Francisco's music world is a small place. Martin mentioned he had a gifted composer who needed to reconnect with performance. He didn't tell me it was you." "And he didn't tell me you'd be here," Julia replied. They both chuckled just a little. There was a pause. Something unspoken passed between them, mutual recognition. The wariness between them dimmed, replaced by something like respect. "I'd like to see your compositions," Constance said at last. Julia blinked again. "Really?" "Unless you left your talent on the stage," Constance replied dryly. Julia hesitated, then handed over the leather-bound notebook she'd been gripping all morning. Constance took it and flipped to the first page. She read in silence, then the second, the third. Her eyebrows slowly began to rise. "These are layered, sophisticated, not just technically strong but emotionally intelligent." She looked up. "You've been hiding twice, Miss Hayes. First your performance, then your pen." She closed the notebook and handed it back. Then she reached into her handbag, pulled out a business card, and offered it to Julia. "The San Francisco Chamber Orchestra is looking for a composer in residence. The position includes occasional solo performances and collaborative arrangements." Julia stared at the card. Her hand trembled not from fear this time, but from the sheer weight of possibility. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Constance replied simply. Talent like yours shouldn't be kept in the shadows. Julia took the card and held it close. For a moment, the students who had once dismissed her now gathered, cautiously, curiously. One approached. That was amazing, he said. Can I ask what bowing technique you used during the shotgun transition? Another leaned in. What finger positioning were you using on those double stops? They were perfect. Faculty members were next offering invitations to guest lectures, workshops, even ensemble work. One asked if she'd consider mentoring students. Another offered to introduce her to the director of the regional symphony. Julia smiled, dazed but grounded. The noise around her faded slightly as she saw Constance watching from a short distance. Their eyes met again. This time, Constance gave her a proper nod. Not approval from a pedestal but something closer to a welcome. Julia nodded back. 3 months later, Julia Hayes stood backstage at the Herbst Theater, violin in hand. The lights beyond the velvet curtain bathed the stage in gold. Rows of plush red seats filled with San Francisco's musical elite stretched into the distance, but Julia barely saw them. She stood in a quiet moment before the music began, heart steady, hands calm, the silence not a threat, but a promise. Behind her, the San Francisco Chamber Orchestra waited. Constance Wellington sat in the front row, program folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes, usually sharp with judgment, were focused and calm, watching, waiting. The piece about to be performed was called Emergence, Julia's first original orchestral composition since the day at Westwood. She had written it in the quiet, transformative weeks after the masterclass, when the air around her seemed different, charged with a new kind of energy. The music told a story. It was hers, from the first note to the last. Emergence was the journey of a woman who had buried her gift, suffocated it under fear, only to unearth it and set it free. It began softly, tentatively, like a memory. Then it rose into bold, defiant phrasing, layered harmonies that expressed pain, wonder, and reclamation. She had written it not for applause or acclaim, but to say, "This is who I am." She turned to the orchestra, gave a nod. The first notes bloomed from the strings, gentle, tremulous. Julia didn't wait in the wings. She stepped forward and took her place at center stage, violin raised. The solo was hers to lead. Her bow descended. The first true solo phrase came from her instrument, and it soared rich, alive, and guarded. The orchestra followed her lead, weaving their parts around hers in perfect synchrony. The musicians, many of whom had once only known her as a name on the score, now followed her phrasing as though they'd played together for years. It wasn't perfection that held the audience still, it was honesty. Julia wasn't performing. She was confessing, celebrating, transforming. Backstage, Martin Wallace, her publisher, watched with folded arms and a proud smile. He had pushed her to attend the masterclass, had nudged her gently toward discomfort. He knew her talent had never been in question, but now, everyone else knew it too. Halfway through the performance, as the music swelled into a passage that combined the loneliness of minor keys with the hope of emerging themes, Julia caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection on the polished piano lid. Head high, arms steady, eyes calm. This was no longer the woman who slipped unnoticed into the back of masterclasses. This was no longer the woman who whispered apologies before she spoke. This was someone who had remembered her worth. As the final movement approached, the orchestra dropped into a subdued quiet, allowing Julia to step forward for one last, unaccompanied solo coda to her story. She drew out the phrase slowly, her vibrato warm, her tone filled with a quiet resolution. There were no embellishments, no flourishes, just truth. When the final note faded, there was silence, not hesitation, but reverence. Then the first clap came from Constance Wellington, standing tall, eyes fixed on Julia, expression unreadable but deeply focused. More followed, then more, another standing ovation. But this one felt different. At Westwood, the applause had been disbelief turned to awe. Here, it was recognition. Julia stepped back, bowed. As the applause continued, she looked toward the wings and saw students, some from the master class, watching her with admiration, some even with tears. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Julia returned to the green room to change. There was a soft knock on the door. Constance entered, holding a folded copy of the night's program. "You led them beautifully," she said simply. "Thank you," Julia replied. Constance walked over, glancing at the sheet music for emergence on the table. "This piece, it's more than composition. It's a self-portrait." Julia nodded. "I think I had to write it before I could move forward." Constance sat in a nearby chair. "Performance anxiety never truly disappears," she said, almost as if confessing. "But it can be reframed, controlled, even used. I've seen very few artists channel it as effectively as you just did." Julia was quiet for a moment, absorbing the unexpected compliment. "Do you still think I shouldn't have stopped playing?" she asked, a faint smile forming. "I think," Constance replied, "that you needed to stop. And now, it seems you're ready to begin again." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but full. Julia opened her case, gently placing the violin inside. Her hands were still steady, her breath even. "I think I am too," she said. Weeks passed. The night at the Herbst Theater had rippled through San Francisco's music circles like a dropped stone in a still pond. Julia Hayes, once unknown, was now a name passed between conductors, teachers, and performers alike, spoken with curiosity, then admiration, then awe. But Julia didn't chase the attention. She simply worked. She accepted the composer-in-residence role at the San Francisco Chamber Orchestra. Her days were now filled with rehearsals, writing sessions, and performances, not just her own, but collaborations that made her rediscover why she loved music in the first place. She taught, occasionally, but only when she felt she had something personal to offer. What mattered more was the authenticity she brought into every room. Her past was still with her, those years of silence, that one frozen audition, the long period of hiding behind staff lines and orchestral arrangements. But they no longer defined her. They were chapters, not the ending. One afternoon, she stood alone in the practice hall where she had first met Constance Wellington. It was empty now, sunlight pouring through the high windows, warming the polished stage. Her footsteps echoed as she walked slowly to the same spot where she'd once clutched the violin with trembling hands and eyes full of fear. She placed her notebook, still worn and leather-bound, on the nearby bench. This time, she opened it not to hide, but to share. Her fingers flipped through pages of music, some old, from the lonely years, some new, born from recent joy and rediscovery. Her handwriting had changed subtly, still precise, but looser now, freer, less guarded. She smiled. Then, from behind her, came a voice. "You never returned this." Julia turned. Constance Wellington was holding up the visitor badge Julia had worn that fateful day, creased and faded. "I thought you might want a souvenir," the critic said dryly. Julia laughed. "I think I've earned an upgrade." Constance handed her the badge, now enclosed in a small, elegant frame. Julia took it, and they stood quietly for a moment, surrounded by the ghosts of that day. "You've grown into something remarkable," Constance said. "Not just as a musician, as a person." Julia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out at the empty seats and asked, "Why me? That day, you could have chosen anyone. Why single me out?" Constance folded her arms. "Because you looked like someone who was trying not to be seen. And those are usually the ones worth seeing." There was no smugness in her voice, no manipulation. Just honesty. Julia nodded slowly. I used to think hiding was safe, she said. That it was better to let others carry my music, to be invisible. But that day, when you called me out, when you pushed me, I realized I wasn't protecting myself. I was shrinking. Constance smiled slightly. Sometimes the people we try to break are the ones we end up helping. They sat in silence again, both staring out at the room. Eventually, Constance stood. I won't take up more of your time. I just wanted to see where it all began. Julia watched her go, the door clicking gently behind her. She looked down at the frame badge in her hands. Visitor. She smiled. Not anymore. That evening, Julia opened a live-streamed solo recital in front of an international audience. She wore the same gray cardigan, not as a statement of simplicity, but as a reminder of where she started, of who she once was. The piece she opened with was her own one she'd finished just a week before. It had no title yet, but its melody carried themes of awakening, of risk, of joy discovered. Each note was a step toward something larger, and when she reached the climax, the music didn't shout, it declared. The chat filled with praise. Comments flooded in from around the world. Where has she been all this time? Her music speaks to the soul. This made me cry. I quit music years ago. And now I want to try again. But one message, simple and small, stood out from the rest. Sometimes we need to be pushed to remember who we truly are. Julia closed her eyes as the final note faded into silence. This time, she didn't wait for applause. She didn't need it. She had already won the most important thing of all, herself. Have you ever hidden your talents, afraid of what others might think, of failing, of being seen and judged? Julia Hayes reminds us that our greatest power often waits on the other side of fear. That even if we walk away from something we love, it's never too late to return. Your gift doesn't disappear just because you stop using it. It waits, patiently. And sometimes, it takes someone else, a teacher, a critic, or even a stranger, to remind you what you already know deep inside. You are more than your fear. You are more than your failures. You are meant to be heard.